"Put her down," Adrian Vale barked into the microphone, pointing straight at the man holding his unconscious wife. The ballroom froze as Eugene Manole slowly turned, tattoos visible beneath the collar of his black suit, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Get away from her before you regret it." And suddenly, every person in that room realized the powerful politician had just threatened the one man no one in the city ever dared to challenge. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. Adrian Vale set down his champagne glass with the careful precision of a man who had already decided how the night would end. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers hung in cascading tiers above the marble floor, throwing warm gold light across 100 of the most powerful people in the city. Senators, billionaires, journalists who could build careers or bury them with a single headline. They had all come dressed for celebration tuxedos, evening gowns, silk and diamonds, and the particular brand of confidence that only old money produces. Nobody had come expecting a massacre. Adrian smoothed the white boutonniere on his lapel, adjusted his bow tie with 2 fingers, and stepped toward the microphone at the center of the room. He was the kind of man who owned every space he entered, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, dark hair swept back with practiced authority. He smiled at the crowd the way politicians always smile, like warmth was something he had studied rather than felt. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for joining us this evening." Applause rippled through the room. Lois stood near the edge of the stage, watching him. She wore emerald green, a sleek, floor-length dress that caught the chandelier light in a way that made her look almost luminous. Dark waves of hair fell softly past her bare shoulders. From a distance, she looked like exactly what Adrian needed her to look like. Elegant, composed, the perfect political wife. Up close, her hands were trembling. She didn't know why he had called her forward. He hadn't told her. He never told her anything anymore, just summoned her with a look and expected her to appear, smiling, at his side. So she had appeared. She always appeared. That was her mistake. "I asked you all here tonight," Adrian continued, "not simply for charity." He paused, let the silence stretch. A skilled move she had watched him do it 100 times in front of cameras and committees. The pause that made people lean in. The pause that said, "What I am about to say matters. I asked you here as witnesses." The applause faded. Confusion moved through the crowd like a slow current. Adrian reached beneath the podium and lifted a manila folder. He held it above his head with one hand, turning slightly so the cameras could see it clearly. "My wife," he said, "has been stealing from this city for 4 years. The word hit the room like something physical. Lois heard it and felt nothing for exactly 1 second. The strange, suspended moment before a body registers that it has been struck. Then everything rushed in at once. The gasps, the turning heads, the low, horrible murmur of 100 people recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the woman standing 10 feet from the microphone in an emerald dress. Every illegal transfer. Adrian opened the folder and began reading. Every fraudulent account. Every dollar rerouted from public infrastructure funds into private holdings. He looked up, directly at her. "Her signature is on all of it." Lois opened her mouth. No sound came out. She knew those documents. She had seen Adrian place papers in front of her routine things, he always said. "Administrative. Sign here. Don't worry about it. I'll explain later." She had signed because questioning him had consequences she still carried the marks of. She had signed because she was afraid. She had signed because she was trapped and exhausted, and had long ago stopped believing that anyone would help her. Now those signatures were being read aloud in a ballroom full of journalists. "I have spent months," Adrian said, his voice dropping into something quieter, more sorrowful, the performance of a betrayed man, trying to understand how the woman I married could do this to me. To this city, to the people who trusted us. Someone in the crowd laughed, softly at first. Then with less restraint, phones appeared. Dozens of them, screens glowing, cameras angled toward her face. Lois could feel them even without looking, the specific sensation of being recorded at your worst moment, of becoming content, of your pain being filed away as entertainment. The tiered cake on the display table beside the stage wobbled as Adrian swept past it, gesturing broadly toward the documents, 3 tiers of white and gold. It toppled in slow motion, almost dignified in its collapse, and hit the marble floor in an explosion of frosting and scattered sugar flowers. The wreckage spread across the stone in chunks. A piece of white icing landed on the hem of Lois's emerald dress. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs had stopped receiving instructions. The room was tilting not dramatically, not like the movies, but in that quiet, terrible way that precedes unconsciousness. The chandeliers swam above her. The sound of the crowd became distant and layered, like voices underwater. Adrian pointed at her, jaw set, finger extended like an accusation given physical form. This woman. Her knees buckled. She went down beside the ruined cake, dark hair falling across her face as she hit the marble, the emerald dress pooling around her in the wreckage. The crowd surged with noise, shock, excitement, the particular chaos of a room full of people who don't know whether to help or keep filming. Most of them kept filming. Nobody moved toward her. Nobody except one man. He had been standing near the back of the ballroom still, quiet, almost invisible among the crowd. Tall, dark suit, black shirt, no tie. Neck tattoos climbed above his collar in dark ink. His jaw was cut sharp and his eyes were pale and completely, utterly calm. He had watched the entire thing without expression, without surprise, like he had been waiting for exactly this moment. Eugene Manole moved through the crowd the way water moves through stone, without effort, without announcement, following the path of least resistance until there was no more distance between him and the woman on the floor. He knelt beside her, slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. Then he stood slowly, steadily, and cradled her against his chest. Her dark hair fell back from her face, the emerald dress draped across his arms like something ceremonial. The ballroom went silent. Adrian's voice tore through the speakers. Put her down. His finger leveled. His face had gone deep red beneath the chandelier light. The boutonniere on his lapel trembled with the force of his breathing. His eyes were wide not with rage alone, but with the first flickering edge of something else, recognition. Eugene turned slowly to face him. When he spoke, his voice was low. Quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't need a microphone. Get away from her before you regret it. 100 people stopped breathing, because every single person in that ballroom had just realized who was holding Adrian Vale's wife in his arms, and nobody in this city argued with Eugene Manole twice. It hadn't started here. It had started 3 months earlier, in a dimly lit nightclub at the edge of the city with a woman in an emerald dress, a glass of whiskey she hadn't touched, and a man who made the mistake of noticing her 3 months earlier. The nightclub was the kind of place that existed specifically for people who needed to disappear. No loud music, no flashing lights, no crowds pushing toward a bar 3 people deep. Just low amber lighting, leather booths tucked into shadow, and the particular silence of a room full of people who had all, in their own way, come to be alone together. The kind of place where nobody asked questions, where the bartender refilled your glass without making eye contact, and the other patrons understood, without discussion, that whatever brought you here tonight was your business and nobody else's. Lois Vale had been coming here for 6 weeks, always on a Tuesday, always after 11, always in something that suggested she had come from somewhere important. A dinner, an event, a function attended by people whose names appeared in newspapers. Tonight it was a deep emerald wrap dress, delicate gold earrings, hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She looked like a woman who had everything. She sat at the far end of the bar with a glass of whiskey she spent more time staring at than drinking. Her wedding ring caught the light every time she moved her hand. A large, brilliant stone, the kind of ring that was chosen to be noticed to communicate something about the man who gave it, rather than the woman who wore it. She twisted it absently, the way people twist things they've forgotten they're holding, a nervous habit she probably didn't know she had. Eugene Manole noticed it the first night. He sat at a corner table, his table. The staff knew better than to seat anyone else there with a glass of water and nothing else. He wasn't there to drink. He was rarely anywhere for the reasons other people were there. He came to the club 3 nights a week out of habit, out of the comfort of familiar surroundings, out of the simple preference for quiet over silence. He was not a man who drew attention to himself, which was remarkable, given that attention was the one thing he could never entirely avoid. Tall, dark suit, black shirt, neck tattoos that other men in rooms like this wore as decoration, but on him looked like documentation, a record of a life lived in a particular way. His face was the kind that didn't give much away. Not cold, exactly, just contained, economical. the face of a man who had long ago learned that most expressions were a form of vulnerability. He noticed the woman at the bar the way he noticed everything without appearing to. She came back the following Tuesday. Same seat, same whiskey, same wedding ring catching the light, and bruises on her left wrist that her bracelet almost covered. He said nothing. He watched, and he said nothing, because it wasn't his place, and he understood better than most people that unsolicited attention from a stranger, especially a stranger who looked like him, was rarely comforting to a woman sitting alone at a bar nursing wounds she hadn't asked to explain. So he watched, and he waited, and he kept coming back on Tuesdays. The third week, she had a shadow along her jaw that her foundation hadn't fully concealed. She sat with her back slightly angled toward the room, protecting something. She drank faster that night, left earlier, kept checking her phone with the specific tension of someone waiting for a message they were afraid to receive. The fourth week, she cried in the bathroom for 11 minutes. Eugene knew because he counted the time between when she left her stool and when she returned. Eyes slightly redder, lipstick freshly applied, expression carefully reconstructed into something neutral. She was very good at reconstructing her expression. It was the fifth week that he finally approached her. He didn't sit down, didn't lean against the bar with manufactured ease. He simply stood at a respectful distance and said, quietly, "You don't have to keep coming here alone." She turned and looked at him. And something moved across her face, not fear, not quite. Something more complicated. The specific wariness of a woman who had learned that kindness from strangers always came attached to something else. "I'm married," she said, flat, deliberate. She held up her left hand so the ring caught the light. A reflex. A shield she had probably deployed so many times it required no thought anymore. "I know," Eugene said. "I'm not asking you anything." She stared at him for a long moment, dark eyes searching his face for the angle, for the thing beneath the thing, because there was always a thing beneath the thing when men spoke to her. That was her experience. That was what her life had taught her. She found nothing she could name, which, somehow, made her more uncomfortable than if she had. "Then what are you doing?" she asked. "Standing here," he said simply. "That's all." She turned back to her drink. He returned to his table. But Eugene didn't stop watching. Not out of obsession, he wasn't that kind of man. Out of the slow accumulation of concern that builds in a person who has seen enough of the world to recognize when someone is running out of time. She was running out of time. He didn't know the details yet. He didn't need them. The bruises told part of the story. The ring told another. The way she flinched when someone walked too quickly behind her told the rest. The sixth week tonight she looked worse than he had ever seen her. Not physically. The bruises were hidden better this time. Long sleeves despite the warmth of the room. It was something in her eyes. The particular exhaustion of a person who has spent so long surviving that they've forgotten what it felt like to simply live. She sat with her shoulders slightly caved inward. She didn't twist the ring tonight. She just stared at it, like she was trying to remember how she got here. Eugene watched her lift the whiskey glass, set it back down without drinking, lift it again. Then she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, a small, involuntary gesture, and he understood, without needing to be told, that she was 3 seconds from crying in a room full of people. He was already standing before the thought finished forming. He crossed the bar quietly and stopped at the exit just as she reached for her coat. She looked up at him. He spoke before she could say anything. "Someone is hurting you." Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact, stated plainly, by a man with pale eyes and neck tattoos, who somehow managed to make the truth sound like the gentlest thing anyone had said to her in years. Lois Vale's carefully reconstructed expression cracked straight down the middle. She didn't cry immediately. That wasn't how it worked for women like Lois. Women who had spent years learning to swallow things, grief, fear, pain, before they reached the surface. Crying was a luxury she had been trained out of, slowly and methodically, the way Adrian did everything. Not with shouting. Not at first. With silence. With the particular coldness of a man who withheld warmth the way a landlord withholds heat in winter strategically, deliberately, until you were willing to do almost anything just to feel warm again, so she didn't cry. She straightened, pulled her coat tighter across her shoulders, and looked at Eugene Manol with the careful, measuring expression she used on everyone who got too close. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "No," Eugene agreed. "I don't." "Then don't say things like that." "All right." He stepped aside from the doorway, a small, deliberate movement giving her the exit, making it clear he wasn't blocking her path. She noticed. She noticed everything people did with their bodies. She had learned to, out of necessity. She walked past him without another word. Eugene watched her disappear through the door and into the night. Then he returned to his table, sat down, and finished his water. He came back the following Tuesday. So did she. She looked worse. The long sleeves were back, despite the mild weather outside. She sat in her usual seat, with her usual whiskey, and her usual expression of carefully maintained composure. But there was something new tonight, a stiffness in the way she moved when she settled onto the bar stool. The kind of stiffness that came from ribs that hadn't fully healed. Eugene sat at his corner table and said nothing. He had learned patience the way most people in his position learned it, through necessity, through years of understanding that the right moment was rarely the immediate moment, that pressing too hard, too fast, produced only resistance. He had built an empire on the principle that timing was everything. That knowledge, held quietly and deployed precisely, was worth more than any amount of force, so he waited. He watched her flinch when the bartender reached across her unexpectedly. Watched her check the door every time it opened, not with curiosity, but with the trained alertness of someone cataloging threats. Watched her phone light up twice with a name she didn't answer, and watched her jaw tighten both times, and watched her drain half her glass in the 30 seconds after the second call. He watched all of it, and said nothing. It was 2 weeks later when she finally spoke to him first. He hadn't approached her, hadn't made eye contact, was simply sitting at his table when she appeared beside it, coat already on, bag over one shoulder, dark hair loose around her face. She looked like she had been standing there for a moment before he noticed her, working up to something. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked. "I like the quiet," he said. "You watch me. I notice things. It's different." She studied him. "Most men who notice things want something." "Most men," Eugene agreed. She pulled out the chair across from him, sat down without being invited, a small act of defiance, or perhaps a test. He didn't react, didn't straighten, didn't smile, didn't do any of the things men did when a beautiful woman chose to sit with them. He simply waited, the way he always waited, with the particular stillness of someone who had nothing to prove. "What are you?" she asked. The question was oddly direct, raw, even. "Depends on who you ask." "I'm asking you." He considered that. "Someone who pays attention," he said finally. Lois looked at her hands for a moment. The ring caught the amber light. She didn't twist it tonight, just looked at it, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "I told you I was married," she said. "You did. I meant it as a warning, not just information." "I understood that," Eugene said. "I'm not interested in your marriage, Lois." The use of her name made her look up sharply. "I know who you are," she said. Something changed in her voice, a new layer of caution. "I know what you are." "Then you know I'm not someone who needs to take things that aren't offered," he said quietly. A long silence settled between them. The low music of the bar filled the space, something slow and instrumental that asked nothing of anyone. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Lower. Like something had loosened slightly in her chest. "He monitors my phone," she said, not looking at him, looking at the table. "He has someone follow me twice a week. He knows I come here. He lets me come because," she paused, jaw tightening, "because he thinks it's pathetic. A sad little wife drinking alone. He finds it useful. It fits the story he tells about me." Eugene said nothing. He had learned that silence, at the right moment, was the only container large enough to hold what some people needed to release. "The story," she continued, voice barely above a murmur, "is that I'm unstable, that I have a drinking problem, that I've made poor decisions with money, that I'm not well." She finally looked up. "He's been building that story for 3 years. Very carefully, very patiently." A sound escaped her, not quite a laugh. Something more broken than that. "He's good at patience." "Why are you telling me this?" Eugene asked. "Because you already know something is wrong," Lois said, "and you haven't run. And I'm so tired." Her voice fractured on the word, just slightly, just enough. "I am so tired of pretending in front of people who can see it anyway." She pressed her lips together, steadied herself, pulled her coat tighter. "If he finds out I've said any of this to you, it won't go well for me." She stood. Her eyes met his directly for the first time, dark, exhausted, but with something still burning underneath. Something that hadn't gone out yet. "Stay away from me, please. Whatever you think you can do, you can't. Nobody can." She turned toward the door. Eugene watched her go. He stayed at his table for a long time after she left, turning his water glass slowly between his palms, staring at the empty seat across from him. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and made a single phone call. "I need everything you can find," he said quietly, on a politician named Adrian Vale. The file arrived 3 days later. Eugene read it at his desk in the back office of a building that appeared, to anyone who cared to look, to be an unremarkable import consultancy on the quieter side of the financial district. The office itself was sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, a lamp that threw more shadow than light, a window that looked out onto a narrow alley where nothing interesting ever happened. He preferred it that way. The file was thick. His people were thorough, they had learned to be, working for a man who considered incomplete information more dangerous than no information at all. He read slowly, methodically, the way he did everything, without reaction, without rushing, turning each page with the steady patience of someone who understood that the truth rarely announced itself in the first paragraph. It announced itself on page 11. The business holdings first. Adrian Vale had 17 registered companies across 4 jurisdictions. On paper, they were legitimate consulting firms, property holdings, infrastructure investment vehicles, the kind of corporate architecture that wealthy men built to organize their assets and minimize their taxes. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would raise a flag. Except 4 of those companies had no real operations. No employees, no offices, no contracts. Just bank accounts that received large transfers on irregular schedules and redistributed those funds after careful layering through subsidiary accounts into holdings registered under a single name. Lois Vale. Eugene set the page down. He picked it up again. Her name appeared 14 times across the financial documents. As director, as signatory, as the registered owner of accounts that had received, over the past 3 years, a combined total that made the number sit uncomfortably in the chest when you read it. She hadn't known. He was certain of that before he finished the page. The pattern was too clean, too deliberate, the kind of careful, methodical construction that required a great deal of effort to make one person appear guilty of something another person had done entirely. Adrian hadn't just been stealing. He had been building a container for the blame, quietly, patiently. The same way Lois had said he built everything. 3 years. He had been preparing this for 3 years. Eugene kept reading. The political corruption was extensive, but not surprising. He had suspected as much from the moment her name first crossed his desk. Bribery payments routed through charity foundations. Government contracts awarded to companies that donated generously to Adrian's campaign funds. Regulatory decisions that consistently favored specific corporate interests. The kind of corruption that flourished in plain sight because it was dressed in the right vocabulary and surrounded by the right people. What surprised him was how far it reached. And then he turned to page 23, the infrastructure bill. 3 years ago, a sweeping piece of legislation that had restructured commercial zoning regulations across the city, effectively closing several legitimate import and development operations that hadn't been given adequate notice or reasonable transition time. Eugene had lost 4 businesses in 8 months because of that bill. He remembered the period well, not with bitterness exactly, but with the specific clarity of a significant wound. He had requested a meeting with the relevant committee, had been told, through intermediaries, that the legislator overseeing the bill had no interest in discussing exemptions or transition arrangements with men of his particular background. The message had been delivered with the particular smugness of someone who believed they were untouchable. He hadn't known then that the legislator was Adrian Vale. He knew now. Eugene closed the file, sat back in his chair, looked at the lamp throwing shadows across the wall for a long moment. There was something clarifying about the complete picture. He had come into this expecting to find an abusive man using his wife as a shield, and he had found that. Exactly that. But he had also found something larger. A man who had built his entire existence on using other people as instruments, who had looked at a frightened woman and seen legal infrastructure, who had looked at the city and seen a mechanism for personal enrichment, who had looked at Eugene, years ago, and seen someone disposable. He reached for his phone. "Keep going," he told his associate. "Financial records, communications, anything with a timestamp. I want everything that exists." The second file arrived 5 days after the first. This one contained phone records, partial transcripts from calls routed through an encrypted line that his people had taken considerable effort to access. Eugene read them at the same desk, under the same lamp, with the same unhurried patience. The calls were between Adrian and a lawyer Eugene didn't recognize, not yet. The content was careful, deliberately vague in the way that legally trained people learn to be when discussing things that couldn't be discussed openly. But the architecture of what they were planning was visible beneath the careful language, like bones beneath skin. They were preparing a public event, a gala charity, high profile, maximum media attendance. The framing was philanthropic, but the purpose, read clearly between the lines, was surgical. Adrian intended to use the event to surface the financial irregularities connected to Lois's name, to present them publicly, in front of journalists, before any formal investigation could begin, to control the narrative completely. Once her reputation was destroyed in public, the divorce would follow. Her credibility gone, her name attached to the crimes, she would have no platform and no standing to contradict whatever story Adrian chose to tell afterward. He would walk away clean. She would walk into a courtroom carrying everything he had done. Eugene set the transcripts down on top of the first file. He thought about the way she had looked at her wedding ring in the bar. The tired, fractured thing her voice had become when she said she was tired of pretending. The bruises she had learned to hide. The 3 years she had spent signing documents she didn't understand, while her husband quietly built the case that would eventually destroy her. He thought about the 4 businesses he had lost because of a man who had decided, from a position of protected power, that the rules existed for everyone except himself. Then Eugene stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the narrow alley where nothing interesting ever happened, and made the decision that changed everything. Not out of vengeance, though, that was present, honest and unadorned, somewhere beneath the surface. Not out of desire, though, something about her burned quietly at the edges of his thoughts in ways he hadn't fully examined. Out of the simple, unambiguous recognition that what was happening to Lois Vale was wrong, and he was one of the few people in this city positioned to do something about it. He turned from the window. "Set up a meeting," he said quietly. "All of them. Tonight." The work was about to begin. The invitation arrived on a Thursday. Cream-colored cardstock, embossed gold lettering, the kind of stationery that communicated wealth not through excess but through restraint, the confidence of a man who knew that understatement, in the right circles, said more than decoration ever could. The Vale Foundation Charity Gala. An evening of philanthropy and community. Black tie. RSVP required. Eugene turned the card over in his hands once, set it on his desk beside the growing stack of files his team had compiled over the past 2 weeks. Then he looked at the man sitting across from him, his most trusted associate, a quiet, precise individual named Brody, who had been with him long enough to know that being summoned to this office after midnight meant something significant had shifted. "Who has confirmed attendance?" Eugene asked. Brody placed a printed list on the desk. Eugene scanned it without picking it up. Senators, corporate executives, 3 media editors, 2 federal prosecutors, who attended every high-profile social event in the city because proximity to power was its own form of currency. Journalists from 4 major outlets. 100 guests, minimum. He built the room carefully, Eugene said. He did, Brody agreed. Maximum witness count. Maximum media presence. Anyone who matters will be there. Eugene looked at the invitation again. An evening of philanthropy. The language was immaculate, warm, civic-minded, entirely without menace. Adrian Vale understood something that most corrupt men never grasped. The most effective traps were the ones that looked like gifts. "Tell me the rest," Eugene said. Brody opened a folder. Our contact inside his legal team confirmed the structure of the evening. The gala runs its normal course for the first 90 minutes. Dinner, speeches, the foundation presentation, everything legitimate, everything recorded. He paused. Then Vale takes the microphone for what the program lists as a personal address. And the real purpose? He presents the financial documents during the address, frames it as a voluntary disclosure, a man of integrity bringing irregularities to public attention before the press does. He positions himself as the victim, a politician betrayed by the woman closest to him. Brody's voice remained level, professional, but something tightened briefly at the corners of his mouth. The documents are forged, carefully. They'll pass a cursory review. By the time a formal audit challenges them, the narrative will already be established. Eugene said nothing. The divorce filing is already prepared, Brody continued. His legal team submits it the morning after the gala. She'll have no platform, no credibility, and no financial resources. He's been quietly liquidating the joint accounts for 6 months. Whatever's left is tied to the accounts registered in her name, the ones connected to the illegal transfers. The room was very quiet. Eugene stood and walked to the window. The city spread below him in patterns of light and dark, a familiar geography he had spent a lifetime learning to read. From this height, at this hour, it looked almost peaceful. "She has no idea," he said. It wasn't a question. None. As far as we can tell, he hasn't changed anything in his behavior toward her. Same routines, same surveillance. He doesn't want her to run before the event. Brody paused. He needs her in that room. Eugene thought about her at the bar. The way she sat with her shoulders slightly caved inward, protecting herself from a threat she couldn't name because it surrounded her completely. She had spent 3 years inside this trap without knowing its shape, walking its perimeter in the dark, feeling the walls, unable to find a door because Adrian had built it without one. He had built it around her. "The gala is in how long?" Eugene asked. 18 days. He turned from the window. 18 days was enough time. Barely. But his people were good, and the evidence they had already gathered was substantial financial records, phone transcripts, witness testimony from 3 former associates of Adrian's who had their own reasons to want the man exposed. The infrastructure was there. What it required now was architecture, a plan precise enough to dismantle in one evening what Adrian had spent 3 years constructing. He thought about the gala room, 100 witnesses, maximum media presence, journalists with cameras already running. Adrian had chosen that configuration deliberately. He had built the audience that would destroy Lois. Eugene intended to use the same audience. "There's something else," Brody said. His tone shifted slightly, the specific register of a man delivering information he knows will land heavily. Eugene looked at him. "She came into the club last night, Tuesday." She looked. Brody stopped, chose his words. "She looked like someone who has started to give up." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Eugene had seen it before, that particular stage of a person in prolonged crisis, where the exhaustion stops presenting as distress and starts presenting as stillness. A dangerous, deceptive stillness. The kind that people around them sometimes mistook for stability. He knew what it actually meant. It meant the internal resistance was failing, that the part of a person that kept fighting was running out of reasons to continue. She didn't know help was coming. She didn't know that the documents bearing her name were being systematically countered, that the accounts Adrian had built in her name were being traced to their actual origin, that the phone transcripts of his conversations with his lawyer were sitting in a folder on Eugene's desk. That 18 days from now, in the same room where Adrian planned to bury her, every piece of evidence needed to bury him instead would be ready. She was walking toward the trap completely alone, and there was nothing Eugene could do to warn her, without risking Adrian discovering that his plan had been compromised. If Adrian knew if he sensed any disruption, he would accelerate the timeline, change the location, find another way. Years of careful preparation would scatter. The trap had to spring the way Adrian intended, just with a different outcome waiting on the other side of it. Eugene sat back down at his desk, pulled the nearest file toward him. 18 days, he said quietly. Brody nodded. "Then we use every one of them." Eugene opened the file. His expression was composed, certain, the face of a man who had already decided how this ended. "Nobody is going to walk into that room and destroy her. Not while I'm still breathing." He picked up his pen. And the real work began. The meeting happened at 2 a.m. Eugene didn't hold meetings during business hours for things like this. Business hours were for things that could survive daylight, legitimate contracts, public-facing decisions, the ordinary machinery of his above-ground operations. What happened in this office, at this hour, existed in a different category entirely. The 6 men seated around the table understood that distinction without being told. They had each, in their own way, built their lives around it. Eugene stood at the head of the table. No files in front of him, no notes. He had never needed them. His memory was the kind that retained information the way stone retained cold, completely, permanently. 18 days, he said. "Here is what we need." He spoke for 40 minutes without interruption. When he finished, the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms went quiet when the people in them were processing the scale of what they had just been asked to do. Not reluctance, these were not men who shied from complexity, just the specific silence of professionals recalibrating. Then, one by one, they nodded. The financial records came first. His accountant, the meticulous man named Garvey, who had spent 20 years untangling corporate structures for people who paid extraordinarily well for discretion, spent 4 consecutive days reconstructing the paper trail behind Adrian's 14 shell companies. not just identifying the fraud, documenting it in a format that would be immediately legible to a federal auditor, a journalist, or a judge. Every transfer, every date, every account number cross-referenced against the corresponding company registration. Garvey delivered his findings on a Tuesday evening, setting a bound document on Eugene's desk with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman presenting finished work. Eugene read it in 2 hours. It was comprehensive, it was airtight, and it showed, with the clarity of something that could not be argued with, that every transaction registered under Lois Vale's name had originated from accounts she had no operational access to, accounts controlled exclusively by Adrian and managed by 2 financial intermediaries whose names appeared in 3 other fraud investigations across the past decade. Her signatures were on the documents, but the money had never touched anything she controlled. She had been used as a name on paper, nothing more. Eugene closed the document, set it carefully to the right side of his desk. The recordings were harder. His communications specialist, a former signals analyst who asked no questions and expected the same courtesy in return, had been working for 10 days to compile usable audio from the encrypted line Adrian used for sensitive calls. The encryption was sophisticated, military adjacent, which told Eugene something useful about the kind of people Adrian had relationships with. But sophisticated encryption still required human beings to operate it, and human beings made small, consistent errors. On day 11, the specialist placed a USB drive on Eugene's desk without a word. Eugene plugged it in, listened through headphones for 3 hours, making notes in the margins of a yellow legal pad in handwriting so small it was nearly illegible. 22 recordings. Combined runtime of 4 hours and 17 minutes. Conversations between Adrian and his lawyer, between Adrian and his 2 financial intermediaries. One conversation, the one that made Eugene set his pen down and simply listen, between Adrian and a senior official in the city's financial crimes unit. A man whose job it was to investigate exactly the kind of fraud Adrian had spent 3 years committing. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. In it, Adrian discussed the timeline of his plan, the gala, the public disclosure, the divorce filing, and the assurance casual, almost bored, that the investigation, when it inevitably came, would find exactly what he had arranged for it to find. Eugene listened to it twice. Then he made a phone call. The witnesses were the final piece. There were 3 of them, former associates of Adrian's men who had worked inside the outer edges of his operation and had each, for their own reasons, reached the limit of what they were willing to carry. One had been quietly discarded when he became inconvenient. One had watched his own business destroyed by Adrian's regulatory maneuvering. One had simply developed, over years of proximity to a man without conscience, a conscience of his own. Eugene met each of them separately, in different locations, at different times. He listened more than he spoke. He asked careful questions and received careful answers. He made no promises he couldn't keep, and no threats he didn't intend to follow through on. By the end of the 3rd meeting, he had signed statements from all 3, corroborating the financial records, corroborating the recordings, filling the gaps that documents alone couldn't close. The evidence was complete. On the 15th day, Eugene sat alone in his office and looked at everything spread across his desk. Financial records, transaction logs, audio recordings, witness statements, corporate registration documents tracing every shell company back to its origin. A complete, methodical, devastating portrait of a man who had spent a decade treating people as instruments and the law as a suggestion. He thought about the 4 businesses he had lost, the meeting request that had been dismissed without response, the particular contempt of a man who believed that power was permanent. He thought about Lois in the bar, the bruises, the ring she twisted without realizing she was doing it, the way her voice had fractured on the word tired like a hairline crack finally giving way. He thought about what she didn't know, that in 3 days, her husband planned to walk her into a ballroom full of cameras and use her as a sacrifice, burning her reputation, her finances, her freedom to protect himself, that she would stand there in whatever dress she chose that night, under the chandelier light, completely unprepared, that nobody had told her, nobody could tell her. The plan required her genuine reaction, required the room to see what Adrian did to her in real time, unscripted and undeniable. The most powerful evidence of all wasn't in any document on this desk. It was what 100 witnesses would see with their own eyes in 72 hours. Eugene stacked the files in order, placed the USB drive on top. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached for his phone and made the call that completed the final piece of his preparation. The one that would ensure that when the ballroom screens illuminated with everything he had gathered, every person in that room would have nowhere to look except directly at the truth. 3 days. Adrian Vale had spent 3 years building his trap. Eugene had dismantled it in 15 days. He turned off the desk lamp. And in the dark, for the first time since this began, he allowed himself to think about what came after. Not the exposure, not the arrest, not the collapse of a corrupt man's empire, about her waking up the morning after, free. The ballroom looked like something built specifically to make people feel small, not in a cruel way, in the way that genuine grandeur operated, by existing at a scale that quietly reminded you of your own dimensions. Crystal chandeliers descended in 3 cascading tiers from a ceiling painted the color of antique ivory. The marble floor reflected the light back upward in warm, fractured patterns. Circular tables draped in white linen held arrangements of ivory roses and trailing greenery, each one centered with a candle that threw soft gold across the faces of the people seated around them. 100 people, exactly as Adrian had planned. They arrived in the way that powerful people always arrive to things, not punctually, but with the practiced timing of those who understood that appearing neither first nor last was its own form of social fluency. Senators greeted journalists. Corporate executives shook hands with city officials. The particular choreography of people who needed each other and had long ago made peace with that fact. The room hummed with conversation, and the delicate percussion of crystal being lifted and set down. Eugene arrived at 7:43 and positioned himself near the back. He wore a dark suit, black shirt, no tie. He had dressed the same way he always dressed, not to blend in and not to stand out, but with the indifference of a man who had stopped thinking about how rooms perceived him a long time ago. The neck tattoos drew brief looks from a few of the guests nearest to him. He didn't acknowledge them. He found his position against the far wall, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and watched the room. Brody was stationed near the east entrance. 2 other associates were positioned at the ballroom's AV control station, a narrow booth behind a curtain at the room's north end, where the screens and sound system were managed. They had arranged access 3 days ago through a contact on the venue's technical staff. The USB drive was already loaded. The screens were ready. Everything was in place. Eugene's eyes moved to the main entrance. Lois arrived at 8. She wore emerald green. Eugene hadn't known what she would choose, and the color stopped something briefly in his chest. The same dress, or one indistinguishable from it, that she had worn the first night he noticed her in the nightclub bar. Dark waves of hair fell across her bare shoulders. Small diamond earrings. A single bracelet on her left wrist, positioned with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned exactly how wide a bracelet needed to be. She looked stunning. She also looked terrified. Not visibly not to a room full of people who didn't know how to read her. Her face was composed with the precision she had spent years developing. She smiled at the right moments, accepted greetings with the practiced warmth of someone who had attended 100 events like this. She was performing flawlessly, but Eugene watched her hands. She was twisting the ring. He looked away before she could feel his gaze and find him. She couldn't know he was here. Not yet. If she saw him, if her face changed in a way Adrian noticed, it would alert something in Adrian that Eugene couldn't afford to alert. Not tonight. Not when they were this close. He stayed near the back wall and watched. Adrian was magnificent at this. Eugene had known it intellectually from the files, from the recordings, from the documented history of a man who had built a career on public performance. But watching it in person was something different. Adrian worked the room with the ease of someone who genuinely enjoyed being observed, touching shoulders, laughing at precisely the right moments, leaning in when someone spoke as though their words were the most interesting thing he had encountered all evening. He greeted Lois publicly, with a hand at the small of her back, and a smile that reached his eyes completely. Eugene watched her absorb the touch without flinching, watched her return the smile, watched the small, invisible adjustment she made in her posture, the bracing, the preparation, the muscle memory of a woman who had learned to receive affection from this man as a warning rather than a comfort. Nobody else in the room saw any of it. The dinner proceeded through its movements. Speeches from the foundation director, a video presentation about the charity's work over the past year. Polished, warm, entirely convincing. Adrian sat at the head table with the comfortable confidence of a man whose plan was running exactly on schedule. Eugene ate nothing, drank nothing, watched everything. At 9:47, Adrian reached beneath the table and placed his hand briefly on the folder beside his chair. A small gesture, barely visible. But Eugene had been watching for it. There it is. He turned his head slightly toward the AV booth. Brody, positioned near the east entrance, shifted his weight. The two associates in the booth received the signal through their earpieces. Ready. At 10 o'clock precisely, Adrian rose from his chair. The room responded immediately, conversation quieting, faces turning, the instinctive attention that a room gave to a man it had been trained to regard as important. He buttoned his jacket as he stood, adjusted the white boutonniere, picked up the folder. He walked to the microphone with the unhurried ease of a man who owned the room completely, which, for exactly 6 more minutes, he did. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian began, "I want to thank you for being here tonight, not just as supporters of this foundation, but as people I trust." He paused. Let the weight of the word settle. Trust. Eugene watched Lois's face across the room. She was looking at her husband with an expression he recognized, the specific attention of someone listening for a signal they haven't received yet but know is coming. Some part of her knew. Some trained, survival-sharpened instinct was telling her that the temperature of the room had shifted. She looked down at her hands. The ring. Turning. "There is something," Adrian said, his voice dropping into that practiced register of reluctant sincerity, "that I can no longer stay silent about." He opened the folder and looked directly at his wife. Lois went completely still. The candles on the tables burned steadily in the quiet room. The chandeliers threw their warm light across 100 upturned faces. Somewhere near the back, a phone screen illuminated as someone prepared to record. Then Adrian Vale began to speak. And the worst night of Lois Vale's life moved into its final hour. Adrian's voice filled the ballroom like smoke. Slow, deliberate, spreading into every corner before anyone realized it was choking them. "I have spent the last several months," he said, "in the most painful period of my professional life, discovering things, verifying things I did not want to believe were true." He paused, looked down at the folder with the expression of a man carrying something unbearable. It was a masterful performance, the reluctant weight of it, the slight tension in his jaw, suggesting suppressed emotion, the way he straightened his shoulders as though gathering the courage to continue. Lois was watching him from the head table. Her hands were flat on the tablecloth now, completely still, the ring catching candlelight with every shallow breath. "The Vale Foundation," Adrian continued, "has been the target of systematic financial misconduct, money redirected, accounts manipulated, public trust violated." He lifted the first document from the folder and held it toward the nearest journalist. The records speak for themselves. The journalist took it instinctively. Looked down, looked up, looked at Lois. That was the moment the room changed. It happened in layers, the way catastrophic things always happened in rooms full of people. First the nearest table, where 2 senators leaned together and exchanged something quiet. Then the table behind them. Then the ripple effect of 100 people recalibrating simultaneously, the low collective murmur of a crowd shifting from audience to witness. Phones appeared, not 1 or 2, dozens. Screens glowing upward, cameras angling toward the head table, toward Adrian, toward Lois sitting with her hands flat, and her face beginning to fracture at the edges in ways she couldn't entirely control. "The primary account holder," Adrian said, his voice dropping further, "is someone I trusted with everything." He turned and looked directly at his wife. Lois, her name in his mouth, spoken with the specific intonation of betrayal, soft, sorrowful, devastating. She had heard him use that voice before, in private, in rooms where no one else could witness what it preceded. But she had never heard it aimed at her in public, in front of cameras, in front of 100 people who were now looking at her the way people looked at something they were trying to decide whether to pity or condemn. She stood up. Eugene wasn't sure she meant to. It looked involuntary, the body's instinct to face a threat vertically, rather than absorb it seated. She stood and she looked at her husband across the distance of the head table, and she opened her mouth. "That's not," her voice came out wrong. Too quiet, too fractured. "The signatures are documented," Adrian said gently, turning back to the room, not raising his voice, not needing to. "The transfers are dated, the accounts are verifiable." Someone at a back table laughed, a single, low sound that lasted less than a second, but Lois heard it. Eugene watched her hear it. He watched something in her face absorb that sound, the way dry ground absorbs the first drop of rain before a flood completely, instantly, with nothing left over. He watched her look around the room at the phones, the faces, the journalists already typing on their devices, the 100 people who had come dressed for celebration and found themselves instead at an execution. Her legs moved her backward one step. Then the display table caught her. The one holding the 3-tiered gala cake, white and gold, elaborate, assembled that afternoon by staff who had spent hours on it. Her shoulder caught the edge. The table rocked. The cake fell in the way that beautiful things fell slowly enough to watch, too fast to stop. 3 tiers separating on the way down, white frosting scattering across the marble in chunks. Gold leaf catching the chandelier light briefly on the way to the floor. Lois didn't look at it. She was looking at her husband, and Adrian Vale was looking back at her with the expression of a man who had just completed something he had been building for a very long time. Her legs gave out. Not dramatically. Not in the movie way of fainting with one hand raised. She simply stopped being able to hold herself upright, the structural failure of a person who has been load-bearing for too long, and went down beside the ruined cake, dark hair falling across her face, emerald dress pooling around her on the cold marble. The crowd erupted. Gasps. Voices overlapping. The scrape of chairs as several people stood without knowing why. A woman at the nearest table covered her mouth. 2 journalists moved toward the head table. A senator put his phone down and then immediately picked it back up. Nobody moved toward Lois. They watched her, recorded her, whispered about her. But the specific paralysis of a crowd caught between scandal and conscience held every person in that room exactly where they were. Nobody moved, except one man. Eugene was already in motion before she finished falling. He moved through the crowd the way he always moved, without announcement, without urgency, following the direct line between himself and where he needed to be. People stepped aside without quite knowing why. Something in his manner communicated a certainty of destination that crowds instinctively respected. He reached her in 11 seconds. He knelt beside her on the marble floor, among the scattered frosting and sugar flowers, and looked at her face. Her eyes were open barely, dark and glassy and confused in the way of someone whose body had made a decision their mind hadn't caught up to yet. A thin line of mascara tracked from the corner of her eye across her temple. She was breathing. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. Then he stood steadily, without strain, and held her against his chest. Her dark hair fell back from her face. The emerald dress draped across his arms. Her head rested against his shoulder with the complete, unconscious weight of someone who had finally, in the most unlikely possible arms, stopped holding themselves up. The ballroom went silent. Not the murmuring quiet of before. Complete silence. The silence of 100 people suddenly uncertain about what they were watching. Then Adrian Vale's voice came through the speakers. Put her down. Low. Controlled. The first crack of something beneath the politician's surface. Eugene looked up. Adrian had come around the head table. He stood 10 feet away, broad-shouldered in his tuxedo. White boutonniere slightly askew now. Jaw set with the rigid tension of a man whose plan had just developed an unexpected variable. His finger leveled across the distance between them. His eyes were wide and dark and doing rapid calculations. I said, put her down. Louder now. The microphone still live, carrying his voice to every corner of the room. Who the hell do you think you are? The room waited. Eugene looked at the finger, pointed at him, then at the man attached to it. He took his time, not for effect, not for the room, but because he genuinely did not experience urgency in moments like this. He had stood in harder rooms than this one. He had faced men with considerably more than a pointed finger. When he spoke, his voice was low. Not raised, not cold in any theatrical sense. Just quiet in the way that certain things were quiet, with the absolute assurance of something that did not need volume to be understood. Get away from her before you regret it. 7 words. The silence that followed them was different from any silence that had preceded them. It was the silence of recognition of 100 people processing simultaneously that the man holding Adrian Vale's unconscious wife was not a guest who had wandered in from the wrong event, was not a bodyguard, was not anyone's plus one. The name moved through the room in whispers. Manole. Eugene Manole. A journalist lowered her phone. A senator took a step backward. The 2 federal prosecutors who had been stationed near the bar exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Adrian's finger remained extended, but something behind his eyes had shifted. The calculations were running faster now, and producing results he hadn't anticipated. He had built this evening for an audience of 100. He had not built it for this. Eugene held Lois against his chest and looked at Adrian Vale with an expression that contained no anger, no triumph, no performance of any kind. Just the steady, patient certainty of a man who had spent 18 days preparing for this exact moment and found, now that it had arrived, that it required nothing more from him than standing still. The boutonniere on Adrian's lapel trembled, and the ballroom screens flickered to life. The screens came on without announcement, no introduction, no transition. Just the sudden illumination of 4 large displays positioned at the ballroom's cardinal point screens that had, until 60 seconds ago, been cycling through the Vale Foundation's charitable work in soft, tasteful graphics. Now they showed numbers. Account numbers, transfer dates, corporate registration documents. The kind of financial data that meant nothing to a civilian at a glance, but meant everything to the journalists and federal prosecutors in this room who understood immediately what they were looking at. The murmuring that had briefly resumed after Eugene's words died completely. Adrian turned toward the nearest screen. Eugene watched the color leave his face, not gradually, instantly. The specific blanching of a man who has just seen the architecture of his carefully constructed world develop a crack that runs all the way to the foundation. Adrian stared at the screen for 3 full seconds without moving. Then he turned back toward the AV booth. "Turn those off." His voice was still controlled. "Barely. Turn them off right now." Nobody in the booth responded. The screens continued. A new document appeared, a corporate registration form for one of Adrian's 14 shell companies. The name of the registered director highlighted in yellow. Not Lois Vale. Not any name attached to her. A name connected directly to an account Adrian controlled personally. The account that had originated every transfer subsequently routed through her name. The paper trail, laid out in sequence, was not complicated. It was actually very simple. A journalist near the front said something quietly to the colleague beside her. Her colleague was already typing. Across the room, 2 other reporters had abandoned their champagne entirely and were photographing the screens with the focused urgency of people who understood they were standing inside a story rather than watching one from a distance. The audio began on the 3rd minute. Eugene heard the collective intake of breath move through the room when Adrian's voice came through the ballroom speakers, not live, not from the microphone. Adrian was still gripping at the head table, but recorded, slightly compressed. Unmistakably him. "The investigation will find what I've arranged for it to find. That's not a concern." A pause on the recording. His lawyer's voice responding, careful and clipped. Then Adrian again. "She signs whatever I put in front of her. Has done for 3 years. By the time anyone looks closely, the narrative will already be set." The ballroom was absolutely motionless. 100 people standing or sitting exactly as they had been when the audio began, as though movement might cause them to miss something. Phones were still recording, but arms had lowered. Attention no longer divided between documentation and experience. They were simply listening. Adrian set the microphone down on the head table. It was a small gesture. Quiet. The gesture of a man who had just understood that the instrument he had relied on to control the room was no longer useful. He looked around at the screens, at the journalists, at the prosecutors near the bar who were no longer making any pretense of casual observation, at the 100 faces turned toward him with the particular expression of people revising everything they thought they knew about a man they had trusted, donated to, voted for, defended at dinner parties. "This is fabricated," Adrian said. His voice had lost its practiced register. The warmth was entirely gone. What remained was something harder and less controlled, the voice beneath the performance, angular and exposed. "Every piece of this has been fabricated by a man with a criminal history and a personal vendetta. Eugene Manol is a Mr. Vale." The voice came from near the ballroom entrance. A man in a dark suit that was not a tuxedo. Behind him, 4 others in identical configuration. The specific purposefulness of their posture communicated their function to every person in the room before a badge appeared. Adrian stopped speaking. "We'd like you to come with us," the man said, professionally, without drama, the particular tone of law enforcement that had already completed its paperwork before entering the room. "You have no grounds. We have the financial records, the audio recordings, and 3 signed witness statements." The man paused. "We've had them for 72 hours. We were waiting for the right moment." He looked briefly toward the screens, then back at Adrian. "Your event provided the audience." The room erupted, not in the chaotic way of panic, in the way of 100 people simultaneously releasing the breath they had been holding for the past 4 minutes. Voices overlapping. Journalists moving toward the exits to file. Guests turning to each other with the wide-eyed energy of people who had just witnessed something they would describe for the rest of their lives. Adrian Vale stood at the head table of the room he had built for his wife's destruction and watched it collapse inward around him, with the stunned immobility of a man who had planned for every contingency except this one. His lawyer appeared at his elbow from somewhere, murmured something urgent. Adrian wasn't listening. He was looking across the ballroom to where Eugene had been standing with Lois in his arms. The space was empty. They were already gone. Outside, the night pressed cool and quiet against the ballroom's gilded walls, as Adrian Vale's hands were guided behind his back, and the career, the reputation, the carefully constructed empire of a man who had spent a decade believing himself untouchable, began its total and permanent collapse. Inside the ballroom, on the marble floor beside a ruined cake, a single emerald shard of fabric lay where Lois had fallen. It was the only evidence she had ever been there. The night air hit her face first, cool and clean and carrying the faint smell of the city in the way that outdoor air always did after too long inside a sealed, climate-controlled room, like being reminded that the world was larger than whatever space had been containing you. Lois became aware of it gradually. Then she became aware of arms. The steady, unhurried motion of being carried. The solid warmth of a chest against her shoulder. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer than she needed to, not from unconsciousness, but from the strange, fragile suspension of a person afraid that opening their eyes would end something they hadn't finished feeling yet. She felt safe. The recognition of that sensation arrived with a kind of grief attached to it, because she knew, in the way the body knew things before the mind caught up, that this feeling was rare, that it had been rare for a very long time, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be held by someone and feel her own muscles release rather than brace. She opened her eyes. The ballroom ceiling was gone. Above her was open sky, dark and wide, scattered with the diluted stars that managed to survive the city's light. They were outside. A service entrance, she thought distantly, noticing the plain concrete of the building's exterior where ornate stonework had been moments before. She looked up. Eugene was watching the path ahead, jaw set, eyes moving across the surrounding space with the automatic vigilance of someone who had learned to read environments for threats before reading them for anything else. The neck tattoos disappeared into his collar. His expression was composed, focused. He hadn't noticed she was awake. She studied his face for a moment in the way that people studied faces when they thought they weren't being observed, looking for the real thing beneath the presented thing, searching for the calculation or the agenda or the version of kindness that had a price attached. She found none of those things. She found someone who was simply, without drama or performance, carrying her out of a building where something terrible had happened, as though it were the most natural thing, as though she were not a complication or a debt or a problem to be managed, but simply a person who needed to be somewhere safer than where she had been. "You can put me down," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, hollowed out. Eugene looked down at her, stopped walking, set her feet gently on the ground, keeping one hand at her back until she found her balance, which took a moment longer than she would have liked. She stood in the cool air in her emerald dress, mascara she could feel dried on her temple, hair loose around her shoulders. The sounds from inside the ballroom were muffled out here. Voices. Movement. The distant, controlled authority of law enforcement managing a room. She looked up at him. "What happened in there?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. Some deep, animal part that had been waiting for a long time for something to finally break in the other direction. "He's being arrested," Eugene said simply. She absorbed that, pressed her lips together, looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. The screens. The recordings. Her voice was careful, measured, feeling its way toward a question she hadn't fully formed. "That was you." "Yes." How long?" 18 days. She stared at him. "You did all of that in 18 days. He said nothing, which was itself an answer. The cool air moved between them. Somewhere above the building, a siren began distant at first, then closer. Then the specific pattern of vehicles arriving at a specific address with a specific purpose. Lois looked at her left hand. The ring was still there, heavy and brilliant and entirely wrong on her finger in a way she felt with sudden, overwhelming clarity. She pulled it off. It came away more easily than she expected. She held it for a moment, this object that had represented so much and so little simultaneously, and then she closed her fingers around it and lowered her hand to her side. She looked at Eugene. "Why?" she asked. The question was simple, direct, stripped of everything except what it actually was. Genuine incomprehension from a woman who had spent years in a world where nobody did anything without a price attached. "Why did you do any of this?" Eugene was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone constructing an answer. The silence of someone being honest about something they hadn't fully examined until it was asked of them directly. "Because someone had to," he said. She held his gaze, searching it, looking for the thing beneath the thing, the way she always looked. The habit of survival she hadn't yet unlearned. She found nothing except exactly what he had said. Something released in her chest, quietly, without drama. The slow, structural giving way of something that had been held rigid for a very long time. Her eyes filled. She didn't stop them. She was too tired to stop them, and there was no performance required out here, in the cool dark, with no cameras and no 100 faces, and no husband carefully monitoring her expression for weakness he could use. She let the tears come. And Eugene stood where he was steady, unhurried, the way he had always been, and said nothing, because he understood that some things didn't need words placed around them, that some moments required only the simple, uncomplicated dignity of being witnessed by someone who wasn't going to use what they saw against you. Eventually, the tears stopped. She breathed. The city moved around them in its ordinary, indifferent way. Traffic somewhere, voices somewhere, the vast mechanical hum of a place that continued regardless of what happened inside any single building on any single night. "What happens now?" Lois asked. "Now," Eugene said, "you go home, you sleep. Tomorrow you call the lawyer whose number Brody is going to send to your phone in the next few minutes." He paused. "Everything else gets handled, one day at a time." She nodded slowly. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. 2 words that were entirely inadequate, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. Eugene held her gaze. Then he nodded once, the small, certain nod of a man who had done what he came to do, and required nothing from it. A car appeared at the end of the service road. Brody at the wheel. Headlights low. Eugene walked her to it, opened the door. She got in. He stood at the curb as the door closed. She looked at him through the window as the car began to move. He was already turning, already walking back toward the building's entrance with the unhurried, purposeful stride of a man returning to whatever came next, back toward the shadows at the edges of things where men like him had always existed and would always exist. The car carried her out into the city. Lois pressed her closed fist, the one holding the ring, against her knee, and for the first time in 4 years, the future felt like something that belonged to her. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.